Okay, hello everyone. I'm Hanna Poffenbarger and I'm a postdoc at Iowa State University. I just finished my PhD there in December and joined the University of Kentucky as assistant professor of soil nutrient management in March. So I'm going to present a portion of my PhD research, a piece that's focused on economics of integrated crop livestock systems. I'm also going to present some work by the Practical Farmers of Iowa, project led by Meghan Filbert, who's the livestock coordinator at PFI. So I can use this. I've got lots of tools. Okay. So there's a number of benefits of integrated crop livestock systems, and most of these relate to this miraculous capacity of ruminant livestock to convert cheap, environmentally benign feedstuffs into those products that we can use. So this is really great because, the livestock are creating this market for our forages, which are some of our best species for conserving the soil, protecting water quality. In the case of alfalfa, it's fixing nitrogen. When they're grown in crop rotations, they can reduce the buildup of pests, weeds, and diseases. And then the livestock, of course, are also providing manure, which is building up soil organic matter and enhancing soil fertility. And there's this idea that, with a more diverse farm operation, you have multiple different sources of income, and that will help reduce variability in income year to year because you have sort of a buffer from low commodity prices or low yields with the multiple forms of income. So the Murchison farm experiment, which was the experiment that generated the bicycle wheel plot that we saw earlier, this was established back in 2002 in central Iowa, so right in the heart of the Corn Belt. You can see on this map that, I don't know if this, that this region is really, predominantly corn and soybean production, and so that's one of the treatments in the experiment, but the goal of the experiment was really to document the benefits of integrated crop livestock systems. So the experiment also includes an integrated crop livestock system. I'm just going to talk today about the 4-year system. That's the corn, soybean, oat, alfalfa rotation. The corn and soybeans are harvested for grain. The oats harvested for grain and straw, and they're undersown with alfalfa, which is harvested for hay the year following establishment. So the livestock are not physically present at the Murchison farm experiment, but they're considered a component of the rotation in that the farmer probably wouldn't be growing the alfalfa if they didn't have the livestock. And so the manure is actually applied to the experiment at a rate that would correspond to what cattle could produce that's being raised off of that crop rotation. So actually we already saw a version of this, but I've amended it a little bit with some other variables that we've collected since 2012. And so the blue line here is the corn-soybean rotation. The green line is the 4-year integrated with livestock. And again, we can see the benefits in terms of productivity with higher yields in the longer rotation, and then the dramatic reductions in energy, nitrogen inputs, herbicide, freshwater toxicity. Nitrate leaching is much lower in the extended rotations. Soil conservation, less erosion with the inclusion of a perennial crop, and then improvements in soil quality as measured by potentially mineralizable nitrogen, particulate organic matter, and microbial biomass. And so the benefits to yield, this is kind of a mystery. There's probably a lot of factors that can explain the rotation effect that are seen, like in many cases, many different studies. In the case of Murchison Farm, the higher yields, the higher corn and soybean yields probably relate to improved soil quality as well as a reduction in the severity and incidence of diseases. That's especially true for soybean, which has much lower sudden death syndrome in the longer rotation. And then the reduction of nitrogen fertilizer inputs, that's explained by first a reduction in the amount of nitrogen that is applied to corn. So here we have our 2-year and our 4-year rotation. During the corn phase, we see only 24 pounds of N per acre on average versus 152 in the 2-year. Because that corn is following alfalfa, so you have the residual nitrogen and more mineralizable nitrogen coming from a previous alfalfa crop. And of course, the input of the manure is reducing nitrogen fertilizer needs. And then the other reductions come from the fact that you have 3 other crops in the rotation that have a much lower, they don't receive nitrogen inputs. The 2 there is just nitrogen associated with the phosphorus source. So when you average over the 2 crops in the 2-year system or the 4 crops in the 4-year system, we see a 91% reduction in nitrogen fertilizer requirements. And then for the herbicide use, the 2-year system is sort of conventional weed management regime with broadcast herbicides applied. And then in the 4-year system, banded herbicide application is used in the row, and then between the rows, the weeds are managed with an inter-row cultivation. And then again, you have these 2 other crops in the rotation that are not receiving herbicides, and so you see this dramatic reduction in herbicide inputs. The benefits in terms of the soil conservation and reducing the nutrient losses, those relate to the fact that, well, in a 2-year rotation, you have 2 summer annual crops that leave the ground bare with no roots for at least 6 months during the year, during the spring up until about June before the soil is actually covered. And then in the fall again, you have this period where the soil may be mineralizing nitrogen, especially in Iowa where we have a lot of organic matter, but if there are no plant roots taking it up, it can easily be leached. But when you have these extended rotations, the small grains and the perennial forage crop, they help to keep the ground with roots growing, and so there's less of a risk for erosion and nutrient losses averaged over that whole rotation. And so farmers really recognize, this is results from a survey in Iowa, farmers really recognize the benefits of the extended rotations for improving soil health. 63% agree, 56% agree that a longer rotation will reduce pesticide needs. The question really is whether this system can be as profitable as the dominant corn-soybean rotation. So 41%, the majority of the, more than any other category, farmers were uncertain about the profitability. So that's what we're going to talk about. Are these integrated crop livestock systems actually economically feasible in the Corn Belt? And so the systems that I evaluated, I assumed a 1,000-acre farm, conducted the analyses for 2008 to 2015. The first system was the standard 2-year rotation with corn and soybean grain sold to the market, fertilizer used as the nutrient source. The next system was a 2-year integrated system with corn and soybean grown again, but corn grain and corn silage were fed to animals, corn stover used for bedding in the production of yearlings. And then the manure coming from the yearlings was used as a primary nutrient source, additional fertilizer applied as needed. This system produced 1,500 cattle per year. And then we had the 4-year cash system, the corn, soybean, and alfalfa rotation with corn grain, soybean grain, oat straw, alfalfa hay, all sold to the market. And then the 4-year integrated system, the corn, soybean, oat, alfalfa. In this case, corn grain was used for feed, corn stover for bedding, oat silage, and alfalfa hay used for feed. The remainder of the products were sold to the market. And for that system, we use backgrounding and then finishing. So we started the calves at a lower weight, 500 pounds, to allow better use of the forage from the alfalfa hay. In that case, there were fewer cattle that could be raised because they did have a longer growth cycle, and corn grain was really the limiting component of the ration. And so in the 4-year system, you had less area in corn production than the 2-year system, so you had less production of corn grain. So I wanted to describe briefly how the budgets were constructed for the integrated crop livestock systems. We have our crops and our livestock. We have inputs for both sides. We have a sale of a portion of the crop products, a sale of the meat, the allocation of a portion of the crop products to livestock production, and then the return of manure to cropland. So crop costs in the budget included any inputs that were used in crop production. The revenue included the sale of products to the market as well as the sale of products to the livestock enterprise. The livestock costs included the feed and bedding materials from the crop production, as well as inputs used for the livestock, like the purchased livestock and the purchased feed and manure spreading costs. And then the livestock revenue included the fertilizer replacement value of the manure. The livestock farmer was we were assuming that that producer was actually receiving money for the nutrient value of the manure and also for the sale of the meat. I'll just go through these very briefly. The crop yields and farming practices were based on that Marsden farm experiment. The prices came from USDA resources, input costs from Iowa State's cost of crop production, as well as the machinery and labor costs. Fertilizer rates were based on Iowa State recommendations. For the livestock enterprise, we developed the diets using Iowa State's brand system, which allows you to develop rations and estimate average daily gain. Cattle prices were from Iowa State documents. Feed prices were the same as what we used in the crop production side. Most of the other costs associated with the cattle production came from Iowa State documents or from pen closeout reports from Iowa. And so the profitability was simply revenue minus cost, except we didn't include land and management. So when calculating the whole farm balance, that was the sum of returns to land and management for crops plus returns to land and management for livestock. So this is the revenue generated from first just the crop enterprises of each system. You can see slightly higher revenues in the 2-year system than the 4-year systems. That's because we had more corn being produced in the 2-year rotations than the 4-year rotations. The integrated systems generally had higher revenue as well because we had that additional source of revenue coming from the stover production that was used for the bedding. The livestock generated a lot more revenue than the crops. We can see there's higher revenue from the 2-year than the 4-year just because we had more cattle produced in that 2-year system. And then looking at the whole farm, that's just the sum of revenue from the crop and the livestock. So costs generally followed the same patterns as the revenue, and so all the systems that had higher revenue tended to have higher costs. And so as a result, when you look at the profitability, they're actually quite similar across all the 4 systems. And so this returns to land and management does not include land, but you can see here, in general, the systems were profitable even if you consider the land rental cost. And then, try not to cough. The one other thing about this analysis was that those integrated systems surprisingly actually had greater variability in the profits among years. That was a little unexpected. And that's because that livestock production actually was a bit more volatile in terms of profits year to year than the crop production. So integrating that actually did increase the variability in profits among years. So our profitability did consider the cost of labor, but oftentimes people also want to look at the labor hours that are required in each system. And so that's what's presented here. The distribution gives you an idea of labor required among different months during the year. And so we found that labor was indeed lowest for that 2-year system and much higher for those integrated systems. And so just kind of tying all the pieces together, we did find higher productivity in that 4-year system, much lower inputs and environmental impact, better impact on the soil quality, similar profitability, but much higher labor requirements was kind of the major drawback of the 4-year integrated system. So now I'll talk a little bit about this on-farm research trial that was conducted by Practical Farmers of Iowa in northwestern Iowa, and this is looking at economics of cover crop grazing. So we already heard some of the benefits of grazing cover crops. We know, obviously, they have a lot of benefits to soil conservation, water quality, and then for livestock production, extending the grazing season, providing relief to spring pastures, providing a clean calving pasture, saving money and reducing reliance on storage feed, which means that you have more control over your costs if you're having to buy less hay. And then, of course, depositing manure where needed and not just all in one particular spot or requiring spreading operations. So this experiment looked at 3 farms in northwestern Iowa, and they did cover crop grazing for 2 years. The area grazed ranged from about 85 acres to about 683. The stocking weight ranged from about 500 pounds to about 300 pounds. Ooh, thanks. And then the number of days grazed ranged from about 50 to about 90. So the value of the cover crop for grazing was based on the value of the feed that was saved from grazing the cover crop, and that was calculated based on the dry matter requirements of the animals grazing during that period. So they just, in this case, it was a cow-calf operations. They assumed that the weights were maintained and they were just feeding the dry matter requirements during that period. So that's kind of how the value of the cover crop and the residue was calculated. Thanks. And then the value also included the cost share payment, which either came from NRCS or Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. The cost included the cost of cover crop establishment and termination, labor, fencing, and waters. If the farmer was already planning to use a burn-down herbicide or was already planning to graze crop residue, then some of those costs were not added on. So it's just really the additional costs from grazing the cover crop beyond what the farmer would have already done. And then net returns were calculated with the cost share or without the cost share. In general, that with the cost share, the grazing cover crops was profitable. Without the cost share, it varied from either negative balance to positive balance. I don't know why that keeps changing that line orange instead of blue. This is looking at the net returns of the cover crop. The green line here is where the cover crop was grazed. The blue or orange, the blue points and orange line represent where there was no grazing, and the x-axis here is fall cover crop biomass. So, you know, when there was no grazing, then the net returns were slightly negative and not affected by cover crop biomass. But where there was grazing, there was a positive relationship, so more cover crop biomass produced in the fall before grazing led to higher profitability of the cover crop. And then I also looked at the net returns of the cover crop without that cost share, just to see, you know, how much cover crop biomass do you really need in order to make money off the cover crop, even without the cost share. And the answer to that was you need 0.74 tons per acre produced in the fall prior to turning the cows out in order for it to be profitable. So I have some copies of this report, and the other project that I described has also been published in case anybody, I can actually pass out the reports because I may have enough for everyone. This is also available at the Practical Farmers of Iowa website. And so I just conclude by saying that integrated crop livestock systems really enable farmers to produce food profitably with minimal chemical inputs, minimal impact on the environment. We saw 2 examples today of how integrating livestock into a cropping system can provide productivity and environmental benefits while maintaining or possibly increasing profitability. So I'd like to thank the various collaborators and funding agencies on this work. And I don't know if we have time for questions. Okay. Yes. I don't know if there's that trend. I know within Practical Farmers of Iowa there's interest in grazing cover crops, but I don't know if there's, I would say in general the trend is still declining livestock production in Iowa. That's been the trend, and I don't think that this work has reversed that, but I would say that most researchers who look at our nutrient reduction goals would say that in order to meet them, we do need to bring livestock back.
Yeah, so it looked like having the livestock on the farm increased the variability of the profitability. So just the cash systems were a little more, were less risk. So
Yeah.
having forage and getting money for the forage, like selling the forage, is that, did I interpret that?
Oh, well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, that's an option, but without the livestock, there isn't really a market. So I use the market prices, but like, you know, it's not really exactly. So then you still need to have livestock somewhere. But yeah, I guess for an individual producer, using that 4-year rotation, I don't know. There we go.
What was contributing to the large variability there with the livestock?
Just, and I'm sure that the livestock producers can speak to this better. I mean, from what it looked like to me is that year to year, it's big swings in how profitable the. Yeah, it's kind of like, I looked at the ratio of fed cattle to feeder cattle, and that was a major determinant. Is when you're selling it, what the price is relative to where you bought it. Yeah, 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 I agree. And I guess one point to add to that is one of the things that Meghan did too was to compare profitability of cover crop grazing versus just corn stalk grazing, which is what some producers are currently doing with livestock, and found that even with the extra cost of establishing and terminating the cover crop, that was more profitable than just the corn stalk grazing. So. Yeah, and some of the surveys that have come out from Iowa is that I would say that most farmers agree with the labor thing, especially with the older age of the farmers. Is like we're not going to get back into cattle now, like, you know, but a younger generation maybe holds the promise for the future.
Something I think too, a lot of your, go back to 11 and 12.
So I'm gonna pass out my reports, and if you'd like to take one from the PF5 project.